At 2:17 a.m., the ICU corridor hummed the way it always did when life hovered between decisions. Machines whispering, lights dimmed just enough to respect the illusion of night, and doors hiding stories that were never meant to collide, yet somehow always did. No one tells you that fate often wears hospital scrubs and rubber soles, but that the smallest mistake, one wrong turn, one tired step, can rewrite an entire future. If you're drawn to stories about unexpected love, second chances, and hope born in the darkest places, go ahead and like and subscribe now, because what began that night wasn't meant to be forgotten. Ethan Cole hadn't slept in 36 hours, not real sleep anyway, just the kind that comes in jagged fragments while sitting upright in a plastic chair with your arms crossed over your chest like a shield. His 6-year-old son Noah lay 3 floors above him in a pediatric recovery ward, finally stable after an emergency surgery that had turned an ordinary Tuesday into a calendar date Ethan would never stop circling in his mind. Hospitals had become his second language since his wife died 2 years earlier on a rain-slick highway. Beeps meant reassurance, silence meant danger, and the smell of antiseptic still triggered memories he pretended not to have. So when a nurse suggested he take a break, get some water, stretch his legs, Ethan nodded like a man who understood reason even though his body hadn't caught up yet. The vending machines on the ICU floor were supposed to be stocked and quiet, and he followed the blue line on the floor with the dull obedience of exhaustion, counting steps the way he used to count his wife's breaths when she slept beside him. But the hallway forked where it hadn't on the map, or maybe it had, and he simply missed it, because grief narrows the world until even signs feel optional. He pushed open a door without reading the plaque, already rehearsing an apology for interrupting someone's rest, and stepped into a room where the lights were low and the machines were loud enough to argue with each other. The bed wasn't empty. A woman lay there with dark hair fanned across a pillow, her skin pale against the harsh geometry of 4 lines and monitoring cables, a bruise blooming along her collarbone like a storm cloud. Her scrubs were folded neatly on a chair as if she'd planned to come back for them, and the chart clipped to the foot of the bed didn't say patient so much as it said staff, which should have been impossible, but wasn't. Ethan froze, the door clicking softly behind him, his instinct screaming retreat, but then the woman's eyes opened, slow, unfocused, searching, and found him like he belonged there. She didn't panic. She didn't ask who he was. She exhaled with visible relief and whispered, "You're late," as if lateness were the most natural sin in the world and forgiveness were assumed. Ethan opened his mouth to correct her, to confess his mistake, to step backward into anonymity, but nothing came out because in that moment he saw the tremor in her hands, the way her chest rose unevenly, the faint sheen of sweat that told him this wasn't a dream she was waking from, but a battle she was losing. He recognized the signs not from training, but from watching someone he loved disappear inch by inch, and the recognition rooted him to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said instead, the words too quiet to matter, and she smiled. A small, tired curve of the lips that somehow carried gratitude and apology at the same time. The chart caught his eye despite himself. Lena Morris, RN, ICU, admitted after collapse, internal hemorrhage, post-op complications. The dates blurred together, but the truth did not. She was a nurse who had become a patient in the place she knew too well, stripped of authority and armed only with endurance. "They keep telling me to rest," she murmured, eyes flickering to the machines like old co-workers she no longer trusted. But rest doesn't answer questions. Ethan nodded, because he understood. Questions that refused to sleep, and he pulled the chair closer without asking permission, sitting like someone who had already decided to stay. He told her his name because names mattered when everything else was uncertain, and when she tried to lift her hand, he met it halfway, not holding, just steadying, an act so small it felt enormous. She asked about the child. She always asked about children, she said. It was a habit, and Ethan surprised himself by telling the truth, by speaking Noah's name out loud in a room where nothing else felt safe. Minutes passed, or hours did. Time in the ICU didn't obey the rules it did elsewhere. A monitor alarm chirped and settled. Footsteps passed the door and kept going. Lena's breathing even just enough to pretend at peace, and she told him, with the flat honesty of someone too tired for theater, that she didn't know if she would wake up the next morning, that the doctors had been careful with their words in the way professionals are when they want to leave room for miracles without promising them. Ethan listened without trying to fix anything, because he had learned the hard way that some truths didn't want solutions, only witnesses. When he finally stood to leave, because someone would notice, because Noah would wake, because reality would reassert itself, Lena's fingers tightened around his sleeve with surprising strength. "Don't be a stranger," she said. The words weighted with a hope that felt both unreasonable and necessary. Ethan promised nothing out loud, but when he stepped back into the corridor, the hums sounded different, less mechanical, more like a breath being held. He realized he had stumbled into a room he wasn't meant to find, and met a woman who wasn't meant to be alone. And though he didn't yet know how their paths would twist or what the cost would be, he knew, with the quiet certainty that comes only from surviving loss, that some mistakes arrive dressed as mercy, and once they do, there is no pretending you didn't see them. By the third night, Ethan stopped pretending his return trips to the ICU were accidental, because intention has a way of surfacing no matter how gently you lie to yourself. And he found that the corridor no longer disoriented him the way it had before. His feet knew the turns, his body remembered the door, and the hum that once felt oppressive now sounded like a promise that things were still moving, even when he felt stuck. Lena was awake when he arrived, eyes half-lidded but alert, as if she had been listening for his steps rather than the machines, and she greeted him with a tired smirk that suggested she'd already rewritten the story of who he was to her. She asked about Noah first, always Noah, and Ethan told her how his son had eaten half a grilled cheese and declared the hospital less scary today. A victory that felt absurdly large, and Lena laughed, a soft, breathless sound that ended in a wince she tried to hide. Over the next days, he learned the rhythms of her care the way he'd learned the rhythms of grief. When the pain spiked, when the nausea rolled in, when the doctors spoke in conditional verbs and careful pauses. She filled the quiet with fragments of her life, stories that drifted between consciousness and confession, telling him about the first code she ever ran as a new nurse and the night she slept in her car because she couldn't stop shaking afterward, about the fiancé she lost years earlier, to an aneurysm that struck while he slept, and the way the ring still lived in her pocket because taking it out felt like an admission she wasn't ready to make. Ethan listened, not because he had answers, he never did, but because listening had become his truest language since loss taught him how rare it was to be heard without being fixed. Nurses came and went, some recognizing Lena with a tenderness that suggested shared history, others treating her with the distance professionals adopt when one of their own crosses the invisible line into vulnerability. More than once, someone raised an eyebrow at Ethan's presence, and once a resident gently asked if he was family, a question that hung between them like a dare. Lena answered before he could, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, saying, "He's here," as if that settled the matter, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. He brought updates from Noah, drawings taped to the refrigerator in the family lounge, a sticker from a volunteer that read "Brave," the way his son asked each night if the lady with the nice eyes was getting better, and Lena asked for details like they were medication, something to be taken at regular intervals to keep her upright. On the 7th day, complications returned like a storm no one could outrun. Alarms erupted. The room filled with motion, and Ethan was ushered out with a firmness that didn't allow argument, leaving him in the hallway staring at a door that refused to tell him anything. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, the same posture he'd taken 2 years earlier when a doctor had explained in careful syllables why his wife wasn't coming home, and he hated himself for recognizing the pattern even as he prayed it wouldn't repeat. Hours stretched thin and snapped. When a physician finally emerged, their expression was neither victory nor defeat, but something honest in between. Lena had stabilized, they said, but the damage was extensive, recovery uncertain, the future a series of ifs strung together with hope. Ethan nodded like a man receiving weather news he couldn't change, and when he was allowed back inside, Lena's eyes searched for him with the urgency of someone checking whether a lighthouse still stood. "I heard you," she whispered, surprising him, and when he asked how, she shrugged weakly and said that some voices cut through even sedation, especially when they don't ask for anything in return. Days blurred into weeks, and the hospital became a shared address. Ethan balanced his time between Noah's recovery and Lena's rehab, learning to fold chairs into beds and read the room by the angle of a nurse's shoulders. Lena's strength returned in increments so small they demanded celebration, standing with assistance, swallowing without gagging, sitting in a chair long enough to watch the sun slide across the window. And with each step forward came a reckoning she tried to postpone. The likelihood that she would never return to bedside nursing, that the work she loved had cost her more than she could pay. One evening, as rain traced lazy paths down the glass, she turned away from him and said she didn't want him confusing gratitude for something heavier, that people clung in crisis and called it love because it felt safer than admitting how lonely they were. Ethan didn't rush to reassure her. He let the words sit, heavy and true, before answering that he knew the difference, that gratitude faded when the lights came up, but what he felt had only sharpened in the glare of daylight. He told her about his wife, not the sanitized version people expected, but the real one with arguments and laughter and ordinary miracles, and about the promise he'd made to stay open even when staying open hurt. Lena closed her eyes, tears tracking toward her ears, and confessed she was afraid of surviving into a life that no longer fit, of being chosen out of pity rather than preference. He told her, simply, that he chose her presence, not her prognosis, and that whatever shape the future took, he wanted to meet it with her rather than around her. When Noah was finally cleared to go home, he insisted on visiting Lena one last time before discharge, shuffling in with a handmade card and a seriousness that made the nurses smile. He placed the card on her tray and said, with the blunt wisdom of children, that his dad smiled different when he talked about her, like the son had remembered how to work. Lena laughed and cried at once, and Ethan felt the truth of it land without drama. This wasn't a rescue or a debt or a convenient story about timing. It was two broken lines crossing at a point neither could have planned. As they left the hospital that day, Ethan with Noah's small hand tucked into his own, Lena watching from a wheelchair by the window. He didn't know how long recovery would take or how hard the road would be, but he knew the mistake he'd made that first night had become a direction, and that sometimes borrowed time, when honored carefully, turns into something like a life. The months after discharge taught them that love didn't arrive with trumpets or certainty, but with calendars full of appointments, pill organizers that clicked shut with finality, and mornings that demanded patience before hope. Lena moved into a smaller apartment closer to physical therapy, walls bare at first, because commitment felt reckless when her body still surprised her daily. And Ethan learned how to cook dinners that respected dietary restrictions while still tasting like comfort. Noah, stationed proudly at the counter as official taste tester and morale officer. Recovery was not a straight line. It doubled back on itself, stalled, demanded tears in grocery store aisles when fatigue hit without warning. But Lena met it with the stubborn grace that had made her a nurse in the first place, learning to mourn the career she loved without letting grief define the woman she was becoming. Ethan watched her grieve without trying to outpace it, understanding now that healing didn't mean erasing pain, but carrying it with enough honesty that it didn't harden into bitterness. He brought his own ghosts with him, Sarah's laughter echoing in rooms when the light fell just right, and found that speaking her name alongside Lena's didn't dilute either love, but made space for both to exist without competition. They built a life in increments so small they felt invisible until they weren't. Sunday walks that turned into routines, Noah's bedtime stories gaining a second voice when Lena felt strong enough to read, dinners with friends who learned to stop asking careful questions and start bringing dessert instead. When Lena was offered a teaching position at the nursing college, a way to keep her hands in the work without risking her health, she cried in the parking lot from relief and fear, and Ethan held her there until the shaking passed, reminding her that adapting wasn't quitting and that influence didn't require endurance alone. Time softened the hospital edges. Visits became fewer, memories less sharp, until the ICU hummed only in dreams, and the wrong door transformed from a wound into a hinge. On the anniversary of the night they met, Ethan planned nothing elaborate. Just coffee on the balcony at sunrise, Noah asleep inside with his dinosaur pajamas twisted into a knot. But when Lena joined him, hair still damp and eyes clearer than they'd been in a year, he spoke without speeches, telling her he didn't need guarantees or timelines. Only the promise of choosing each other on days when choosing felt easy and on days when it felt like work. Lena answered by opening her palm, revealing the ring she'd carried for years, not as an ending, but as an artifact of love that had shaped her. She said she was ready to let it rest, not because it meant less, but because something new had earned the space. And Ethan slid his grandmother's ring onto her finger with hands that didn't shake, understanding that marriage wasn't a cure, but a commitment to show up anyway. They married quietly, the ceremony small enough to hear every breath, held in a garden behind the nursing college where Lena taught. Former colleagues stood beside new friends, and a few nurses from the ICU attended, their eyes bright with the recognition that outcomes they rarely saw had bloomed where they'd least expected. Noah served as ring bearer with solemn authority, whispering to Lena that she looked extra brave today. And when vows were spoken, they were simple and precise. Promises to listen, to adapt, to honor the living and the dead without letting either dictate the future. As the sun lowered, casting gold through leaves that trembled with wind, Ethan felt the absence of fear rather than the presence of certainty, and recognized it as a gift earned through endurance rather than luck. Later, as laughter braided through clinking glasses and ordinary joy reclaimed the air, Lena slipped her hand into his and said she still woke some nights afraid the machines would call her back, and he answered that he still woke sometimes, counting breaths, but that mornings had taught him fear didn't get to make the final decisions. The years that followed weren't spared difficulty, flare-ups, school challenges, the slow work of blending histories, but they carried a steadiness born from truth. And when Noah grew tall enough to look Lena in the eye and call her mom, without qualifiers, she closed her eyes for a moment and let the word settle where it belonged. Sometimes Ethan thought about the door he'd pushed open without looking, how close he'd come to turning back, and how the world rarely announced its turning points with clarity. He learned to be grateful for exhaustion, for mistakes that redirected, for nights that hummed with uncertainty because they had led him here. If love was a language, theirs had been written in careful sentences, revised often, proofread by grief and hope alike, and signed not once but daily, in the quiet acts that turned borrowed time into a life fully lived.